Welcome to the Middlesex Moments radio show. I am Dr. Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, and joining me today is Terry McNulty, who teaches in our English department. And we're going to be talking about just about many things that spring to mind, and most important to me is that we talk about poetry. So as many of you know, listening to this program week after week, I'm using this opportunity to get to know the faculty who teach here at Middlesex. And I hope that you're experiencing the same kind of joy I am at the people that they are and the skills and talents and gifts that they bring to the task at hand. That's why I want to talk about poetry, because I'm so concerned that it's something that people don't think about every day anymore in the way that they used to across all the centuries of human civilization. So let's start, though, Terry, with why don't you tell me how you decided to get involved in English and major in English and teach English, and then ultimately how you came to love poetry.
That's a long answer to that question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go.
When I was an undergrad, I went to the University of Scranton, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I started out as a communications major. And I pretty rapidly discovered that I wasn't so much interested in the act or theory of communication. I was much more interested in language, and the program that I was in there was also a philosophy-heavy program, so I was sort of guaranteed to walk out with a philosophy major. So I was sort of looking around at things that could complement that, and I took a few English courses, and I really discovered this sort of love for language and this love for how words can work together to create unexpected meaning. So that's how I became an English major, and when I finished at the University of Scranton, I didn't have a real direction. I wasn't quite sure where I was going to go. So I got a free ride to grad school. I went to grad school. And
lucky man.
Very lucky. And I went to the University of Maine, and I studied English there, and I taught there, and I studied poetry there, and that's where I really figured out, wait a minute, I could be a teacher. This could work for me.
Yeah.
And it has over the past 12 years.
University of Maine at Orono.
Yeah.
That's where Bob Kennedy, Dr. Bob Kennedy, the new head of the system, is from.
When I was a student there, he was president. Absolutely. Wow. Yeah. Small world.
It is an incredibly small world. Yeah. Well, did you have fantastic teachers at Maine and at Scranton?
I did. I had amazing teachers. Throughout my life as a student, I had the good fortune of having many, many amazing teachers. And it was when a teacher in Scranton first introduced me to Wallace Stevens that I really sort of figured out it wasn't just language I was interested in, it was poetry itself that I was interested in. And then when I got to the University of Maine, I encountered several simply remarkable people who were so deeply rooted in the world of poetry and had a lot to show me about sort of what happened outside the mainstream of American poetry, especially in avantgarde circles in the 20th century. That was when I was really hooked. That was that was when poetry sort of went from being an interest to sort of something I orbited, an orbital force.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you attend readings? Were there readings up at?
Absolutely, in Scranton and in Maine. And poetry is so much different in the air than it is on the page.
Right.
The poetry readings were, they're great to listen to, but it's also great to just sort of meet people and see what they're doing and to hear what they have to say about what they're doing.
So what readings stand out? What poets have you heard read?
Oh, probably the most amazing reading I went to was a reading by Bob Grenier. He's associated with the Language School of Poetry, which is a movement in poetry in the late 60s through the 70s into the early 80s, which takes language as the center of the poem as opposed to meaning. So the poems become much more about the words than they do about any sort of narrative arc or narrative force. The poems more evoke meaning than make meaning. And he gave a terrific reading more for his description of the process that he was undertaking in the set of poems that he was writing at the moment, which were sort of transcriptions of thoughts in his head written in the dark, so that he'd write out these words and they'd look at them the next day and say, well, I was thinking this word, but look, you can almost sort of see this word there instead. And so that would become the next word in the poem. And he'd sort of, by investigating what he had already written, find new words in the words he had written and make that the content of his poem. And so that description of his process was pretty wild and also pretty opening for me as a writer.
So you're a writer?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
I don't write as much as I'd like.
Yeah.
But when I have time, absolutely, I'm writing.
What do you think about the advice to journal every day or write something every day? I mean, that's often what writing teachers will say.
I resist the impulse of journaling to some degree because I feel it opens the writer to being somewhat confessional. or maybe too confessional. I guess if you look at the history of the 20th century, there's a lot of different avenues, but a main branch in the mid-century was the branch between the confessional poets and the language poets. And I'm not so interested in anything that I have to say. I'm not so interested in anything that I think I have to say. I'm much more interested in the words that might emerge out of things I didn't think I have to say. So to me, journaling runs the risk of trying to control content too much or trying to find something in yourself. Right. I think the poem might be outside of the writer more than in the writer.
Yeah. Wow. It makes me pause. I love talking about poetry. We have to take a break. I wish we didn't, but we do. And when we come back, we'll talk about, maybe it's philology, right? The love of words?
Absolutely,
I think so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome back. With me today is Terry McNulty, who teaches in our English department. And over the break, we were talking a little bit about Mark Twain, because I grew up in St. Louis, and Hannibal, Missouri is just north of there. And I had gone to see Twain's house several times. It's a really small little house with a very short ceiling. But it's remarkable. And he's incredibly important to the literature tradition of Missouri, but also
sure,
in New York.
In Elmira, New York, Twain, Hartford and Elmira sort of battle over Twain and battle over where he wrote what.
Right.
But Twain did a lot of his important writing in Elmira. And I taught at Elmira College for a few years. There's a very proud tradition and a proud connection. They have a Mark Twain Center. And Elmira and Hartford are always connected by Twain and talking back and forth about Twain.
I went to the house in Hartford when I first arrived here because I thought, well, I have to see this.
Yeah.
Is the house in Elmira as extravagant?
No, it's different. The setting is so different because it's called Quarry Farm, and it's up on a hill, and it's this beautiful country view, and I would say it's not as extravagant, but it's a beautiful home in its own right, and Twain's study is a compelling place to sort of hang out for a few minutes too.
Is it, at Hartford, at the Hartford House, they said he wrote on the third floor on a tiny little desk, next to a pool table. But what's his writing desk like?
So the story goes that Twain was actually, he was smoking a lot of cigars while he was writing and got thrown out of the house by his family. So he wound up in this study that was outside of the house, and it's a very tight and cramped space. But because, I don't know if that story is true or not, but because of that story, whenever I was in that area, I would always think of just sort of being surrounded by the cigar smoke, and it feels a little claustrophobic, to be honest with you. But I can imagine Twain sort of cackling in there as he wrote.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think, okay, going back to the language school, which I have to confess I don't know anything about, so I must have stopped reading like criticism of poetry at that point. I wasn't paying attention. So how would you connect the language school with what you read in Twain's work?
Oh, boy.
Yeah, that's a complicated question.
Yeah, I think the language poets are more and more known now than perhaps they were 10 years ago. If you look at literary criticism, or if you even just look at a Wikipedia entry, the language poets were for a long time very ignored, or very sort of cast aside, because you read it and it doesn't make sense. You read a language poem and it's not sensible. It is sensible, but it's not sensical, I guess. You feel it and you're in it, but there's not much meaning happening from the author to the reader. The reader is making meaning as they go, and the author might have made some meaning as they went along too, but there's a disconnect between if there even is any authorial intent and the actual process of reading. To read a language poem is sort of to learn to read again. And that's very distinct, obviously, from Twain's practice, where he so tightly crafted and controlled his narratives. One of my problems with Twain is how tightly controlled his narratives are. They feel almost tyrannical sometimes, that they can't get outside of Twain. One thing the two certainly share, though, is the sense of humor. Not universal across language poetry. There's so many language poets, but you have to sort of find humor in a language poem at times to keep yourself going, to find that nourishment. And Twain was, of course, intentionally uproarious as well. So
sure.
There might be a tenuous connection there, but very different ballgame.
Yeah, you'll have to send me the names, or can you name a few other language poets?
Oh, sure. Probably today the leading figure to come out of language poetry would be Charles Bernstein. He's down, I think, at the University of Pennsylvania now, runs the Writers' House in Philadelphia. Bob Grenier is certainly another one. Clark Coolidge, Susan Howe, people like that.
Okay. And do you happen to know if they are ever translated into another language? I mean, that's, of course, the first thing I would, my first question mark would be, well, how would you shift this into French or into Japanese?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a good question. I know that some language poets did homophonic translations of poetry, like Zhukovsky did with Catullus, sort of bringing the poems back into English by their sound rather than by their sense.
Yeah.
There was a similar game afoot in language poetry, but I don't know anything about translating it into another language. And I'd be curious to see what language poets thought about or would think about that practice, because it would be the creation of a new text. I mean, any translation is the creation of a new text, and it's a political act, but it would have to be a creation of a radically new text, I think. Especially too when you think about process. Like but some language poetry takes off from the tradition of people like Jackson McLowe, where the process is random. So the process of creating a text is you might pull words out of a hat or use a random number generator or something to create meaning. The process of a translation is very deliberate and linear and not so associative or random. So that act of translation, in its spirit, just thinking about it superficially, in its spirit seems counter to the spirit of what would be happening in a language poem.
Do you think that language poets derive from concrete poetry? I mean, that's what I kind of remember, is people would lay William Burroughs, for example, would lay words out on a table and then just sort of pick them at random and put them together. And
I mean, I think that there's some of that there. Though when I think of concrete poetry, I think of poetry that's shaped on the page,
Right.
And there is some of that in language poetry, but I don't see so much of that. While the language movement was happening in the U.S., and I think the easiest way to think of and read the language movement is really to think of it as sort of an outcome of deconstructionism, where it's it's not so much that the author is dead. I don't like that phrase, the author is dead, but it's an outcome of the potential for multiple meaning in a text,
right.
and what a reader can create out of a text.
Right.
But so while that's happening in the U.S., in England, there's simultaneously this concrete movement afoot, which is not so. It's different, but it's not so entirely distinct from what the language poets were after.
Yeah. Well, there's so much to know, and I unfortunately have to take another break, which I suppose, in the context of poetry, makes sense, because we're going to end this stanza and we're going to start with the next one. So please come back. Well, we're back with Terry McNulty, and we're deliberating. I guess I want to deliberate for a moment the state of poetry in American culture. So we were talking over the break a little bit about the avant-garde movement, which I'm always intrigued by, I have to tell you. But so I want to talk about two things. One is the incredible life and vitality of the poetry movement, and there are many, many schools of poetry. But then also, what does it mean for the average citizen? Because poetry, well, certainly poetic, epic poems, were incredibly important in weaving together a sense of identity for a civilization. I don't know if there's any corollary anymore.
So those epic poems created a narrative through which to think, right? I think that we create our narratives today in very different ways, whether those be narratives about reality TV, whether that be sports, whether that be Facebook, what have you. We sort of create our uniting cultural narratives in different ways. And poetry has a reputation, and a justifiable reputation, for being difficult. If a poem is a machine made out of words, as William Carlos Williams said, if it's to be efficient, then it has to be difficult in some ways. I don't know that poetry can right now play any sort of unifying role, and I'm not sure I'd want it to either, in that I really have a distrust of narrative poetry. But what I do think is happening currently in American poetry, and has been for maybe 10 or 15 years, has been a distrust, hatred is probably too strong a word, but a distrust of identity. And I think that the distrust of identity that has emerged, maybe even since, say, the language movement, has emerged as a response to the way that our identities are constructed for us socially, whether that be how our identities are constructed for us by capital or in other ways. And so you see in a lot of poems stuff that, if we take language poems as an example, Bob Grenier has this this poem called A Long Walk, in which he systematically removes the noun from the poem, so that you see this distrust of identity emerge at the level of the language, at the level of the noun. If I can't trust identity, if I can't trust who I'm told I am, or if I can't trust who I think I am because it might be who I've been told to be, then I'm not even sure I can trust nouns, right? And so, and if you look at a lot of different poetry since maybe 1980, that distrust of identity emerges in different ways. I think the contemporary poem must be political. It must be rooted in its time, and by that I don't mean it's like the poem is like waving banners or taking positions or anything like that. But it has to have some sort of relationship with its time. Currently what I see mostly is this distrust of identity emerging in several different ways across contemporary poetry.
Which is in large measure a reflection of our culture, because I would say that's what's happening even with the political parties. We're in the middle of the silly season, and distrust of government, its ability to solve social problems and work toward the common good. That's interesting. Yeah.
And yet there's also this broader embracing of identity that we undertake every day. I mean, we undertake our professional role, or we have our Facebook page with our real name and our photo sitting right on it.
Right.
And so I think we're very amenable to allowing ourselves to being identified. And the poem, especially the contemporary poem, perhaps in its difficulties, I mean, Wallace Stevens said that the poem must resist the intelligence almost successfully. In so doing, it is ultimately identified. If the poem must resist the intelligence successfully, then perhaps the poem can escape identity in ways that our Facebook page cannot.
Talk to me a little bit about your students, and how can they hear this? Can they make sense of what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Whenever I teach an intro to lit class or a lit and comp class, I always try to show the full range of the field of poetry. And one reason that I do that is because I always felt like I was being steered as an undergraduate. And one reason I got interested in poems that don't make a whole lot of sense is because I always felt like I was being steered toward narrative, or steered toward poems that made a lot of sense. And I thought, man, the words are interesting, but I gotta get rid of the story. The story is really boring to me. So I always try to give my students a full scope of everything from, your most traditional contemporary poem to a little bit of John Donne or Elizabeth Barrett Browning to something that's completely insane on the surface. I think that the students really resist the poems that don't make sense, because they're, as beginning readers of poetry, they're still trying to figure out the poems that do make sense.
Right.
And they're trying to get that skill set in place first. But they do get, I think, the value of evoking, as how evoking meaning can be as powerful as making meaning. Whether they agree with that as a claim, as a statement, I think that's up in the air. But I think that they do leave my classes saying, okay, a poem could be this confession of something about myself, and it could also be this broader thing where it's a bunch of words sort of strung together, some of which may not even be words,
Let's talk about traditional students, sort of 18 to 25 years of age. What's their poetic context? I mean, what do they connect what they read in your class to in their real lives?
Well, so I think poetry is universal in that it's easily connected back out to our day-to-day lives, whether that be in evocation or in meaning. So something that is stated in a poem, or something that occurs to us in a poem, is likely rooted in some sort of prior knowledge that we have anyway. So you can't sort of escape the prior knowledge that you bring to a text, and a student is always going to make connections between their prior knowledge and what they're reading. But I think that in terms of poetic experience, it seems to me that generally speaking it's limited. And I don't know how much poetry is read or taught in our high schools. So certainly students listen to a lot of music,
right,
and they read a lot of lyrics. But lyrics and music often have line breaks that end at full stops, and one of the first things that students have to learn, for example, is that we only pause in a poem with punctuation. Don't pause at the line break. Keep going when you're reading and things like that. So the whole process and skill set, I would say, is not fully realized when they come through the door. But the thinking is certainly there. And
then we have a literary magazine, right? So there must be some impulse then among our students to want to create poetry.
Absolutely, and I teach a creative writing class, an online creative writing class, and students write some really remarkable stuff. And sometimes I think that they're not even aware of how good what they're doing is. And I try to share that with them sometimes. Sometimes I say, don't get a big head about this, but I don't think you quite know how good that line is that you just wrote. And also how much you need to fix that next line, right? And that's the nature of introductory creative writing class. But yeah, our students are writing some pretty remarkable things, and I'm always encouraging them to submit that work to Pegasus, our literary journal, or to send it off somewhere else. And many follow through, and some do not.
So when you think about the students that you've worked with and the ones who've been like most receptive to like kind of the poetic energy around us, what qualities do those students possess?
It always comes back to, I think, a love for language. It comes back to, okay, so what happens if I take this word and place it alongside this word? What, especially if they're unfamiliar words. Or if they're words that you wouldn't normally see beside each other. Or what happens if I take this noun and I turn it into a verb, even if it doesn't naturally become a verb, if I just sort of verb the noun? How would that change the meaning of a line or change the meaning of the word itself, right? So it's this sort of natural wonder about language, this natural curiosity about language, but also this desire to see what happens when words create friction with each other, or when words bump up against each other in ways that sort of catch your breath.
So I'm going to find myself lamenting things here now, because as you were saying that, I was wondering, well, what's the comparative strength of having a really good ear, kind of a knack for language? Many people can learn a foreign language pretty much by listening to it. So that's the one hand. And on the other hand, since we always have two hands, on the other hand, what's the importance of understanding the grammar and the way that our language is actually constructed? I mean, if you're gonna verb the noun, you gotta kind of understand what those two concepts even are.
Right.
So
I think.
What do you think?
Well, I think that as any good English teacher will say, you can't break the rules of grammar until you know the rules of grammar. And that's why we have the prereqs in place on a creative writing class that we do. You have to be through English 101 to get to creative writing. But if you are sensible to the rules, then you can break them. If there's a sentence fragment sitting in the middle of a poem and it doesn't seem to be accomplishing anything, I'm going to call you on that. But if there's a sentence fragment in the middle of a poem and it makes something happen in my head that's interesting or that's good, I'm going to sort of let it sit there. Same thing with playing with a part of speech or what have you. We all value things differently, and I sort of have these boxes in my head of how I think about poetry. And in the top box, there's good non-narrative poetry. That's what I really love to read. But below that's good narrative poetry. Then the next box down is bad non-narrative poetry. And the last box on the bottom is bad narrative poetry. And I think that it's really, to me, if you have a good ear, you can cover for just about anything, because I much prefer the music of the text to the meaning of the text. I will let you get away with musical mistakes. I'm not likely to let you get away with narrative mistakes.
Yeah. Right. What a great. I love thinking about these kinds of things. And sadly, we have to draw this program to a close. But I guess I would want to say to our listening audience, I hope you're listening to poetry too.
Absolutely.
And there are lots of different formats for that. There are poetry slams. There used to be the Writer's Almanac, where Karras and Keeler did that. I don't know if they do that here, public radio, but he would read a poem on the radio, which is a great medium for listening to poetry. Or when you see a notice in the paper about somebody coming to read their work, go listen to them.
Absolutely. And if you do a Google search for pen sound, you can check out, there's a massive repository of poetry on the Pen Sound website.
Oh, wow.
Which is totally worth people's time.
Great. Well, thanks, Terry. It's been wonderful having you here. So this has been Middlesex Moments Radio Show, and I hope that if you're interested in Middlesex Community College, you'll take a moment to visit our website, which is located at mxcc.edu. CommNet, that's COMMNET.edu. I'm Anna Wasesha, President of Middlesex Community College, wishing you a good day.